Good morning and welcome to this morning's Softwerx webinar on GDPR. My name is Lindsay and I'm going to be comparing today's webinar, but I'd like to advise you that today's webinar is being recorded, so you will receive a copy of the webinar after today to refer back to. We're joined by three great experts today: Adrian Becker, Technical Director at Softwerx. He's been at the coalface of GDPR compliance for a while now and will bring a real practical insight today. Good morning, Adrian.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I was just arrived late.
And we're also joined by David Smart, MD of Softwerx. Softwerx hold a number of individual GDPR qualifications and have helping dozens of organisations better understand GDPR in the last 12 months. Good morning, David.
Good morning, everybody.
And we're also joined by Karen Cole, a Senior Associate at London-based RIAA Barker Gillette, who's going to be helping us with our Q&A session at the end. Karen's got vast experience in advising on a broad range of businesses across different industry sectors, as well as individuals employed at all different seniority levels. So as you all know, GDPR is a massive subject and it comes into force as of May 2018. So we're less than 12 months away now. And although it might still seem a while away, the regulations will affect all businesses. So it's great that so many of you joined us today and you can help start planning and putting some of these into place. So how ready is your organisation for GDPR as of today? GDPR is a very big subject, so apologies at the outset if you're going to seem overwhelmed by today, but as we've said, it will be recorded so you can refer back to it. And we're also going to focus on today areas that Softwerx have tried to pick out and focus on because it is such a large project. We've tried to focus on the most important parts from your point of view. But we will take questions at the end. If you do have questions, please just put them in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. During the presentation, you don't need to wait till the end. Then I will ask all other questions subject to time, and we'll then get David, Adrian and Karen to answer them. So let's start with our GDPR journey today. Over to you, David, please.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Okay, so let's start with exactly what is GDPR. If you want a formal definition of anything, the best place to start is Wikipedia, right? Well, no, not always, but with GDPR, this definition is really not far out. Three things or three key words to pull out from this: regulation, individuals, and the concept of unifying things. These three words really serve to dominate or define what GDPR is about. And as you will see, are a current theme throughout this presentation. So what actually is GDPR from a physical perspective? We'll get into the meat of that a bit later on, but for now know just that it's an 88-page document made up principally of 99 articles. It is public domain. Anyone can view, read or print it for bedtime reading from the European Journal website. So what are the learning objectives today? What are we trying to achieve in this webinar? Well, basically we want to cut through all of the noise around GDPR and give you a much better understanding from a factual point of view. We're also going to talk about what's actually likely to happen when GDPR becomes law in about 11 months' time. And we're going to give you as much practical advice as possible to help you progress a GDPR project with your own business. Well, finally, we're going to talk a lot about security. Mainly because most businesses that are currently being fined by the ICO, which is a governing body in the UK, are being fined because of data security breaches around personal data. Now that's under the current Data Protection Directive, which is Principle 7. Of course, the headline difference with regard to GDPR is that the decimal point has moved in terms of the fines that can be levied. So some background on GDPR. GDPR is a comprehensive reform of the current legislation, the Data Protection Directive, which is now around 20 years old since its last revision. The two principal objectives are to give citizens and residents back control of their personal data simplify the regulatory environment for international business. So what's GDPR all about? Essentially the privacy of the individual and the simplification or unification of data or data flows. There's also, I guess, the informal drivers to change, endorsed by technological evolution. Google now nearly 20 years old, Facebook. Essentially the proliferation of expansion of data or big data, the increase of data, and also the increase in value of data, with WhatsApp apparently being valued at $20 billion. And of course, a related rise in cybercrime. So at Softwerx, we take this concept a bit further. When work started on GDPR many years ago, the term digital transformation was in its infancy. Data or big data was certainly growing fast, but nobody perhaps knew or forecast the speed or volume of data that would exist or its value. Then there is cybercrime that last year in the UK, as reported by the National Crime Agency, actually overtook normal or traditional crime. So we see these emerging trends, an online digital world driven by data and the exponential growth of cybercrime, finally underlined by a much tougher view on data governance, as kind of creating a perfect storm for businesses, especially the uninformed, unaware or unprepared. But what's your view? What do you know about GDPR to date, and what do you think? For some people, they're fed up already with GDPR. They've heard too much noise about it. For others, and those that are old enough can remember the millennium bug, it's maybe just more hype from IT. Do you actually believe it's Armageddon and you're having some sleepless nights? Or are you certain it means change in the way we do things, but you're not quite sure exactly what? So if you can hold on to what your thoughts are for a moment, because these may change in particular as we go forwards. So what does she think? This very important person who you will get to know through this presentation, but hopefully not on a first-hand basis in the future, is Elizabeth Denham. Elizabeth Denham is the Information Commissioner in the UK. The Information Commissioner's Office is the governing body in the UK that exists to uphold information rights. Perhaps more importantly, and specifically related to GDPR, the ICO is tasked with and empowered to enforce GDPR through commercial penalties where appropriate. So what's her view? You can see here. I guess in a pre-prepared answer to those that see GDPR as an inconvenience or a barrier to productivity, her view is that if pursued correctly, GDPR can not only make a positive difference to the individual, but can also make a business more competitive and efficient. And this, by the way, just for the avoidance of doubt, is also our view at Softwerx. We believe GDPR is a positive change for good, obviously for the individual, but also for business. Perhaps the simplest way to understand or describe the change that GDPR is to see it as the new normal. So it's normal today, if you walk past a building site, to see lots of people wearing hard hats and high-vis jackets. It's normal to wear a seatbelt in a car. It's even normal to work remotely or flexibly. It will be normal. Individual privacy and data security are treated with much more importance in future years post GDPR. So just to cover off some of the myths that we often hear, and there's about a dozen here. Some of the comments that we've heard over the last few months really around GDPR. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail. The first one, ironically enough, came from a data company that we were dealing with that only dealt with, as they saw it, consumers. So GDPR was something that wasn't going to affect them. Lots of businesses think they're too small or they're not in Europe. Perhaps some of the more popular or common ones are it won't be relevant with Brexit and it's not the law. So if we just cover some of those two. So this is from earlier this year. Matt Hancock is the Minister responsible for data protection, and this was the formal statement in that the UK government had put some considerable effort into GDPR, and GDPR would come in effect May 25th, 2018. With Brexit, we think GDPR is effectively Brexit proof. It will be adopted in the short term and will in the longer term be replaced with something very similar or even identical. Why? Because we want to continue to trade with Europe, and rewriting a completely different set of rules makes no sense. Just in case if you're still not sure if your business should be considering GDPR as something important, here's a view from across the pond, also from earlier this year. As you can see, PricewaterhouseCoopers did a survey, and GDPR is a top priority for US-based firms, and you'll perhaps understand why as we go through some of the articles a bit later. Just in terms of law, which is a fairly important point, what we currently have is a data protection directive. What we will have with GDPR is a regulation, includes in the name, I guess. The difference is subtle but significant. A directive requires or allows a member state to enact laws around it to enforce it. A regulation is the law, i.e. GDPR will become UK law in May 2018. So one final and general point around compliance, which is again quite important. You cannot literally be compliant to GDPR yet, in that there's no formal certification that can provide you with a rubber stamp as such, or a kind of get out of jail free card, not that we would advocate a tick and run approach anyway. So compliance within GDPR context is still much more of a verb rather than a noun. Article 42 strongly recommends that member states introduce formal certification at a local or union level, but this has not happened yet in the UK. So be wary of expensive consultancies or agencies that can claim to get you compliant, or at least understand what they mean by compliant. There are worth mentioning two forms of relative or relevant certification with regard to GDPR. One is ISO 27001, which will get you a long way along the line. The other, which is perhaps less well known at the moment, is BS 112. BS 112 is a British standards certification that specifies the requirements for a personal information management system, or PIMS, which is much easier to remember. And this sits very neatly with some of the GDPR requirements. So the regulation itself, obviously we can't step through each and every part of the document in 40 odd minutes. So what we've done is pull out what we think are probably the most important parts, and particularly those that have changed the most from the current Data Protection Act. So there are 99 articles across 11 chapters. In comparison to the current legislation, some areas have not changed very much, some have changed significantly. Of course, the overriding change across the regulation is the level of fines that can be imposed. So it's difficult or dangerous to class any part of the regulation as low risk or priority, but obviously some bits have changed significantly, more significantly, and should be a higher priority from a risk penalty perspective. So we will focus on these chapters, those that change the most with the highest risk penalty. One point we want to make very clear at the outset, and I guess through this presentation, is the link between internet or cybersecurity and GDPR, which is clearly enshrined and amalgamated in Article 32, which is security of processing. And we'll come on to that a little bit later. So let's cover the general provisions, and let's quickly zip through some of these because there's quite a lot of information here. The idea of a natural person is probably just something worth touching on, really. A natural person within the regulation is also a data subject. Note that importantly, neither are necessarily an EU citizen. In fact, the term EU citizen does not appear anywhere in the regulation. A natural person is quite simply a living person, not defined as any type of citizen, not defined certainly as a consumer or an employee or a resident, and certainly not any other type of entity, for example, a company. Examples of non-EU citizens might be refugees, those with residency, those on travel visas, etc. Article 2, just to have a quick look at that. Interesting, makes this distinction between automated and a manual process, or digital and physical. So note, GDPR can include a manual filing system. So here we can see that GDPR is just not about electronic data or computer systems. So for example, if you have a manual filing system warehouse with hard copy information stored, this is covered under GDPR. Article 3, very importantly, makes a territorial distinction, again related to Article 1. It is not the geographic area of the European Union anymore that is only applicable to an EU citizen. So you're probably thinking here, so do they mean any living person anywhere in the world? And the short answer to that is yes. Caveat very quickly, of course, that may be very difficult to enforce, but try and appreciate the logic and it starts to make sense. GDPR applies to any organisations trading within the EU and any organisations that are trading, processing data with other EU organisations. So as an example, might be, as we saw earlier, a US-based company processing data on behalf of an EU organisation, which may be part of a supply chain or even a subsidiary within a group. So have a quick look at the definitions here. So personal data means anything relating to a data subject, natural person, that can be directly or indirectly identify that person. So credit card details would of course be critical, but GDPR is concerned with the privacy of the individual as a whole. So not only just from a commercial perspective. Pseudonymization relates to the practical division of related data, for example, storing a name in one database and an address in another, with some sort of code to tie the two together. And note, pseudonymization is not encryption. There's a definition of a controller and processor. Very large in entire chapter 4 of the regulation. In fact, this is the largest chapter in the whole regulation, and it's where the most change can be found and where there is an entire section on the security of data and processing. For now, just know that whilst a processor may be acting on behalf of a controller, key difference with the regulation, a processor now holds equal liability for any contravention of the regulation directly with the data subject. Consent is now much more important, critical, wider in scope, particularly as you might expect around children. And let's just pause for a second on personal data breach, which is defined here. Worth reading out very quickly. Personal data breach means a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, or alteration, unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. It's the only thing I'm going to read out of the regulation, so don't worry. The point of reading that really is very clear and comprehensive, but note there is no reference to how or why a breach occurred. I'm sure as most people know, a breach can occur for a multitude of reasons. It's not within the scope or remit of the regulation to try and know or list all of these. Adequate security of personal data is your responsibility. So let's look at the principles, in particular Article 5, 6 and 7. So let's just cover off 6 and 7 very quickly, really. I mean, lawfulness is described in a lot of detail in Article 6, but the most important thing to note is tied strongly to consent. Article 5 really defines the 6 key principles for the whole regulation, and most GDPR presentations, I guess you see, will start with these principles. They're largely self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go through all of them. But what's important to note in terms of what an auditor might look for in terms of a practical approach or evidence towards understanding and commitment. So much of the first 3 principles here should be covered in your privacy statement, which may need to now be much more explicit, clearer, and basically more transparent. Principle 4, for example, might practically relate to the correct use of a CRM or HRP or ERP system. In short, it needs to be up to date and accurate. Principle 5, if audited, for example, and you answered with we keep records as long as are required, that would not be good enough. You need to know specifically how and why you are retaining data and for how long. Of course, Principle 6, with regard to data security, is the biggie, or at least the ICO thinks so. Again, just to be very clear with you, most fines currently being levied by the ICO by a long way relate to a security breach of data. It's worth noting, just remembering that these 6 principles form the basis for the entire regulation. So, if you do lose your way, lost in your thinking at some point, then always return to these principles and ask yourself what your practical response might be to an audit or investigation, perhaps following a security breach. So, rights of the data subject. Key thing to note here is the increased number of rights of the data subject and increased emphasis. Subject access requests are now free and the time limits to provide them are much shorter. Very key is a right to be forgotten. Right to data portability is interesting. It means that practically you'll now be able to take your mobile number with you if you transfer mobile providers. So chapter 4, which is controller and processor. What I really want to focus on here, Article 32, I've already read out to you, it's the security processing, so I don't intend to do that again. This is really an area of very high change and high risk, so let's just kind of dwell on this for a moment. Article 33, let's assume you have a data breach. In our experience, most organizations have, or have at least had an attempted attack. What happens next in the new world? Well, in the new world, the major difference is that you must report the breach to the ICO within 72 hours if you are the controller. If you're the processor, you must report to the controller, and this report needs to be a full and comprehensive report. Article 34, which talks about the communication of the data breach directly to the data subject, the natural person affected. Some ambiguity here or some subjectiveness or discretion needs to be reported where there is a high risk to the rights and freedom of a natural person, but not required if, this is vitally important, the controller has implemented appropriate technical organizational measures, and those measures were applied to the personal data affected. So, for example, encryption or training of your users. You would not need to report to the data subject. I think Adrian's going to talk about an example later where you can also that can also apply with the ICO. It's not entirely obvious here. The obvious and key message is to avoid or at least mitigate as best as possible a cyber or data breach in the first place. This will be probably far less expensive than an ICO fine, and perhaps much more importantly, we think far less expensive and much easier than trying to restore your public reputation. Quick couple of words on the DPO, Data Protection Officer, Article 37. Lots of questions often asked us, do we need a DPO? 3 principal reasons why you may need a DPO or will need a DPO. 1 is if you're a public authority, 2 is if you're processing large volumes of data on a systematic basis, and 3 if you're dealing with special categories of personal data around religion, sexual orientation, etc. Again, we get asked if does a DPO, can a DPO only do that job? No, a DPO may have other tasks or duties within a business as long as they don't conflict. A DPO can also operate within a group covering both, for example, controller and processor activities. You can also contract the services of a DPO, which I think is going to be a popular service, i.e., they don't need to be an employee. Very quickly, transfer of personal data here. I don't dwell on this too much. Article 58 is lengthy. Really details why and how it's legitimate to transfer data. In short, where you are transferring data, what it means by adequacy or adequate level of protection is that where you're sending the data needs to have an adequate level of protection, the same as or better than GDPR. So the ICO themselves and their powers, again, I don't want to dwell on this. Their powers are comprehensive and far-reaching. I guess what we would say here, and so would the ICO, though, is the ICO not the enemy. Really take the time to visit the ICO website, look at their resources, and and use these resources, embrace this change to improve your business. Remedies, liabilities and penalties, just to go through these quite quickly. Article 83 is for some people, I guess, the key article in the whole regulation that relates to fines. The two classes or levels of fines depend upon the articles of principles that have been contravened. Level 1 is up to 2% of worldwide turnover, or 10,000 euros, whichever is the greater. And for more serious, level 2 is up to 4% of total worldwide turnover, or 20,000 euros, whichever is the greater. In reality, I guess for most organisations, fines will likely be smaller, but still very significant. And recently there was a £60,000 fine, I think, for an organisation turning over 3 or 4 million, which is still going to hurt quite a lot. Again, the obvious message here is it'd be really good to avoid the risk of being fined in the first place. Just in terms of covering all of this off, really, and perhaps the message throughout all of this is if you've tried your best, and by that you can practically evidence specific measures that you have taken, for example, security user training or encryption, then you're likely to be in a much better position. I think a recent enforcement and fine was with the Medway Council. They were recently fined for not having trained their employees adequately, and those employees inadvertently exposed data. They were fined because they'd been told and warned, and they still didn't train their users. So that's really a whistle-stop tour of the entire regulation. What I'd like to do now is get back to reality, I guess, a bit, and talk about some of the likely scenarios and what's really going to happen. We think possibly, probably post May 2018 next year. So I guess the first one to put on the list really is, well, maybe nothing will happen. Not sure how many hands we'd get up for that. What we would suggest for those that think nothing would happen is we would point them to the ICO website. The ICO have a place on there where action they've taken, enforcements, and also just recently here they've posted increase in data security incident trends and fines that they've done, really trying to help organisations with these level of resources. Next thing that might happen, and depending upon your industry or sector, GDPR may already be a requirement, particularly if you're in the public sector. It most likely will be. If you kind of, I guess, decide to sort of bury your head in the sand and wait, it's likely that your customers or suppliers may be knocking on your door, request to understand what you're doing about GDPR. And again, we make no apologies for banging on that. Quite likely, you will suffer a data breach. The circumstances around what you need to do compared to what you need to do today, i.e. make it public, are very different. You may receive a subject access request. That may be a consumer, it may be from a former existing or former employee, happy, curious, disgruntled, doesn't really matter. And finally, what we think, perhaps unfairly, but if you're a large financial institute of one form or another, we think the ICO will probably be seeking to exercise their muscles and certainly not fall shy of enforcing a large fine where appropriate. Again, to reiterate here, we try not to do some of the big billing, scary stuff around 20,000 euros because for a small organisation, there's many small organisations, and you can look on the ICO website yourself. The levels of fines are not near 20,000 euros, but they are still of a value which would certainly hurt most businesses, certainly hurt our business. So really, that's the end of my pitch on GDPR. What I'd like to do now is hand over to Adrian Becker, our technical director. Adrian's been at the coal face of GDPR, helping a number of organisations for the past 12 months. And what Adrian's going to focus on is how you may be able to practically progress a GDPR project within your organisation, and how he's been helping other organisations on a similar basis.
Thank you very much, David. So, as we've probably seen, GDPR is quite a large subject, touching the whole of the organisation, and with fines of 20 million euro mentioned a risk to the organisation. So how should we approach it is normally a key question that I get from a lot of our customers and a lot of people I'm helping and working with. The first message that I do give to the organizations are GDPR is a holistic approach. It doesn't just belong to IT or HR or legal. It's part of the whole organization's approach and should be covered through each of the following areas. So the first part we look at, what I always say is look at your processes, understand what data is entering the organization, what data is leaving, what personal data are you actually processing on a day-to-day basis. Involve legal. Hence, it's very much the part to review your contracts. For example, employee contracts, supplier contracts, customer contracts, because there's got to be areas like clawbacks in the event of breaches. What do you do when one of your data subjects come and request compensation for losses? What is the rights to be forgotten? What will the impact be to the organization? The next part is technology. Technology is, again, 25% probably of the effort, but also when over 90% of the risk. It's quite easy to be tricked into emailing out a customer list or downloading a virus that has collected all of your personal data and put it out on the internet. One of the theories is, with viruses that's coming out these days, instead of we're encrypting your data and saying, please pay us a ransom, there will be examples of, we have harvested your data and we're going to release it in public if you do not pay us X amount. So blackmail most likely will be another scenario that's going to happen in the future. And then the fourth part is really show compliance. Demonstrate what process procedures you've implemented and how you are actually complying to those process and procedures. From an organization point of view, I would suggest, as well as it entails the whole organization, is to set up a board. A GDPR board that reports into the management team. And the organization says, that's great, we need to implement the board. However, who do we need to be on the board? Well, the first person we need to get on is the data protection officer. Without the data protection officer, actually, you have nowhere to go, because the data protection officer will have the powers to investigate any part of the organization where personal data is being processed. So if I gave an example of what Softwerx has done, is we've put our own cybersecurity board together that's purely on GDPR. We meet every 3 months to report on progress, and we report directly into the group management board. We've involved IT because a lot of the process procedures that we have and safeguards, IT is our first line of defense. A classic example, for example, would be making sure that our mobile phones are encrypted, making sure that laptops are encrypted, but we'll touch on that a little bit further. Compliance is the key part, because if you read through the GDPR articles, you'll see that not only implementing processes, but demonstrating how you adhere to those processes and that they are being followed. Legal, as I touched on, you will need legal contract advice. You will need to make sure that you're processing your data under a legal basis, but also you might also, moving forward, get challenges where people say to you, I would like my data to be erased. However, legal requirements trumps the rights of the individual to be forgotten, as an example. So make sure that your contracts clearly state what information is needed. And Karen can probably expand on that a little bit later. And then also make sure you involve the whole business. You cannot believe how many times we engage with organizations and they believe that it's HR's responsibility or IT's responsibility. And actually, in the best will in the world, IT does not know everything that HR is doing, and HR does not know everything that IT, procurement, sales are doing, and what they do with the personal data. So it's absolutely critical to involve the whole organization. So practically, where do I start? What is the best approach? Well, what I say to our customers is actually understand what data you hold. What personal data is being held? Where is it being held? And what do you do with it? We find that lots of organizations do have an understanding of their databases and their key systems, but what they're not aware of is where their staff are downloading customer lists or staff employee list, or actually the emergency contact list as a classic example being transferred across and kept on a piece of paper in the car as an example. The next part that we also got to look at is understanding what the data impact would be. Do an impact analysis, understand the personal data, what the effect will be if it's breached, what will happen. Also, then look at what is your breach response going to be and what security measures you can implement to mitigate that risk. An example of where I went to a meeting and sat with a board, the HR manager was sitting in the board and mentioned that they had almost 50,000 employee records that they're keeping indefinitely. And on the basis that they went, well, just in case we get an asbestos claim. However, that is legally, yes, they are liable for asbestos claims. However, do they really need to keep all of the information on those employees, or is it a subset of employees that they need to keep? So it's very much understand on a legal basis what information you do have to keep, because if you do not have a legal basis or a legitimate business reason to keep the data, then it should be part of your policy to remove the data once it's obsolete. So as I mentioned, there's 4 principles, with technology being only about 25% of the approach, but probably over 90% of the risk. So organizations say, that's great, thank you very much for telling us all this. What can we do? Well, my first stance is look at the ICO's website. They have made some recommendations of what organizations should implement. And at the moment in time, Cyber Essentials Plus ensures that you've done the basics at least. And if we expand that onto the 2 principles, for example, as we mentioned, if there's a breach, those should be reported to the authority. However, what the article actually says, unless the personal data breach is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of the natural person. So what does that practically mean? I've taken my laptop with myself on the train. I've got all of my emails in there. I might have been mailed customer list or customer contacts. I leave it on the train. The laptop is stolen. If that laptop was not encrypted, I need to notify the ICO that the laptop was lost, the type of data, and depending on what data was on the laptop, I might need to notify each of the individuals that they've been affected and have lost their data. However, if it was encrypted, it's highly unlikely that that data will be compromised. I would still probably report it to the ICO just to be safe, but I won't necessarily need to go and report it to the individuals. So from that point of view, that makes a big impact from a security point of view. So what I want to do now is just cover off very quickly some of the cybersecurity wins that you can implement, and I'm just going to skip through a few of these very quickly. Secure configuration. What organizations need to make sure is make sure that you implement secure firewalls. Make sure that your internet firewalls are patched. Make sure that you have access control implemented. Does everybody need rights to a specific folder, or should all staff be allowed to download the whole CRM database as an example? What shall I do am I patching my workstations? Is my antivirus up to date? Have I actually employed an external organization to try and ethically hack our application that is exposed to the internet? Have I provided social engineering training? And a lot of people ask me, what is social engineering? And it's really educating your users on how to spot if there's an email that's come in that is not legitimate, or doing things on the internet that is not appropriate. And then remember, it's an ongoing process. There's always something else that can be implemented. So from areas that we've been engaging with organizations is like implement two-factor authentication. You stop relying on the user remembering what passwords they should use. Implement data loss prevention. Be notified if somebody is uploading all of your data. For example, one of our customers has just implemented where they inspect every email that leaves the organizations to see if it contains more than 5 telephone numbers. That's a simple security measure they've done to try and limit any exposure. So yes, somebody might still be mailing out personal details. However, they won't be mailing out the whole list. So they've put some security measures in place to mitigate it. Potentially help implement tools that monitor where users are accessing the internet, what they are accessing. Are they accidentally going to a site that will download software onto your network and start retrieving data? And also make sure you have proper backup procedures, because that is absolutely critical, because you will get a breach at some stage. And I think if we look at the BBC at the moment, everybody is talking about the organizations that's been taken down with the new crypto viruses. You will need to report those breaches to the ICO, because the crypto virus has actually transformed personal data, changed it, and has had a breach. And the ICO will then have a look at what process procedures you've done to mitigate against it. And you can report that you've antivirus update, all your systems were patched, and we managed to restore all of the data before anything was compromised. So there's a whole holistic view. There isn't a single answer. There isn't a single technology that will get you compliant. And that's the key message that I want to say to everybody on the call. There isn't a product you can just buy off the shelf that will tick the box and say you are now compliant. What this involves is everybody working together to complete and provide a holistic approach. And it's an ongoing approach moving forward to comply with GDPR. Thank you, and I'll hand back to Lindsay now.
Lovely, thank you, Adrian. Thank you, David. Karen, is there anything that you would like to add from your point of view to the points that Adrian and David have made today?
No, I mean, it's been a great sort of overview of what is an incredibly in-depth regulation that we're sort of faced with next year. All I can sort of urge people to do is sooner rather than later. You know, this isn't something that just because it comes into effect in May of 2018 means that we can sit and wait for that time. It's businesses need to be taking action now to ensure that they're ready come May.
Perfect, lovely. Thank you, Karen. So just before we move on to some questions, some useful resources we'd like to leave you with today. A video very much worth watching from Elizabeth Denham herself from the ICO. It's about 6 minutes, but it's definitely worth a watch, and we'll send you this presentation after today. ICO have also kindly provided a checklist tool. So again, I'd definitely recommend downloading that. Softwerx have provided some great information on GDPR, including some checklists, some guides, and other useful bits of information. If you're interested in Cyber Essentials, then the National Cyber Security Centre is also worth a look. And David touched on this earlier, BS 112 Personal Information Management System. It's probably fits nicely against the GDPR regulations that are coming out, so have a look. And if you want to take the whole GDPR guide and download it, then you're welcome to. I know David has read it many times, and probably so Karen and Adrian, so you're welcome to have a look at that as well. So I'm now going to move on to questions because we've got a great set of questions I want to go through. No particular order, but I'll ask the questions now if I may. First one, does GDPR apply B2B or B2C? David, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, I can answer that one. That's an easy, it applies to both. B2B and B2C are sort of meaningless terms as far as the regulation's concerned. It applies to something called natural persons, which are also described as data subjects. Full stop, period, really. That's it.
Yeah, excellent. Next question. If the data subject, natural person, gives specific and audit permission to transfer personal data to a country with a lesser regulation, is that acceptable? Is it a breach or is it illegal?
Go on, Kat. Do you want to take that one, Kat?
No, by all means. I didn't want to butt in.
No, sure.
The transfer of data is specifically mentioned at Article 44. Individual's consent is going to be irrespective of it. What Article 44 does is restrict data flows to non-EU jurisdictions. The non-EU jurisdictions are referred to as third countries. So controllers and data processors can only transfer data outside of the EU if they put in place appropriate safeguards, and also on the conditions that there's enforceable rights and effective legal remedies for individuals if obviously there is any breach. So just going out and getting an individual's express consent won't be sufficient enough in itself.
So just for clarification, and just so I understand this correctly and everyone else does that mean that, because my understanding of GDPR is if I've got data as Lindsay in my company and I'm sending it to you as a third party, obviously because you're in the EU, your company has to be fit GDPR regulation as well. But if you're then in another country, would that then still apply? So even if you're in the US and that data was going over to the US, then actually you as
if it goes, so obviously we and any other EU state have to comply with this regulation. It doesn't bind anybody else in another country, but if any member state transfers data outside of the EU, they have to make sure that there are appropriate measures and safeguards in place. It doesn't matter whether you as Joe Bloggs the individual has consented to the transfer of data outside of the EU. That in itself won't be enough.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. I think this one's probably for Adrian. If a customer requests their data to be wiped, it is stored in a database and we take database backups. While we can remove them from the database, how would we remove them from a backup, as database backups don't tend to work like this? Do we need to remove older backups if this is not possible to separate the data? If it is not possible to separate the data from the backup?
So this is quite an interesting one, and I think the industry is currently asking the ICO for clarifications, because you're absolutely right. As an example, do I restore every tape to try and delete that record and then re-protect it? If you look at the regulations, it says you have to demonstrate that you've got to comply for right to be forgotten. However, if you can't completely comply, you need to show that technically it's disproportionate and not possible, and why. So for example, as long as you can prove you've deleted the data, you've done everything you can to remove the data, then that should be okay. However, I'm going to say that right now it's open to interpretation, and a lot of online cloud backup organizations are currently waiting for clarification. There is technology now that can let you say, for example, go into a database and purge that record from all of my previous backups. You do get technology like that. However, I totally understand that from an organization point of view, it's almost not possible for everybody. And it's one of the areas they are clarifying. And I'm hoping that common sense will prevail.
Yeah, excellent. What is the definition of personal data as covered by the GDPR? Is it literally any and all data that we hold on an individual, whether customer, supplier, employee, etc.? And just to add to that point, so as an example, if it's an email like Lindsay @ obviously that would, my interpretation would be personal data, but if it's info at, is that personal data or is that company data?
I'll take that one, Lindsay, if you like. I mean, first off, just at the risk of boring everybody, I'll read the actual full definition out of personal data. Personal data means any information relating to an individual or an identifiable natural person, data subject. An identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, an identification number, location data, an online identifier, or to one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of that natural person. In addition to that, and it's not part of that definition, but very much related, point 14 in the same article, and this is an important point, I guess, in terms of personal data, now includes biometric data, which means personal data resulting from specific technical processing relating to the physical, physiological, or behavioral characteristics of a natural person, which allow or confirm the unique identification of that natural person, such as facial images. So I think someone spent an incredible amount of time trying to make that as comprehensive as possible in the shortest paragraph. And what I'd add to that is really that, you know, it's not an exhaustive set of characteristics. And I think, you know, to be absolutely clear, it is, and one should assume it is any information that can be used to identify the data subject is classed as personal data. For your specific example, Lindsay at, wherever, definitely. Info at, no.
Perfect, thank you. Can you define processing of large data better for assignment of a DPO? So large is not a very clear term. Are there any numbers defined? Good question.
Yeah, I'll take that one, Simon. I'll take that one, Simon. And again, the risk of boring people, because it's always good to start with, you know, from the horse's mouth, as it were. So 3 reasons why you might need a DPO. The second one is, and I'll read it literally, the core activities of the controller or the processor consist of processes and operations which, by virtue of their nature, their scope, and or their purposes, require regular and systematic monitoring of data subjects on a large scale. Now, you know, my view of this, for what it's worth, is in previous revisions of the complete regulation, there was a number in there which arguably would have helped all of us understand a bit better. I think that number was, believe it or not, 250. There's some ambiguity about this particular clause, and indeed a number of other clauses, certainly around, for example, security of processing data. It's difficult to know whether that ambiguity was part of the design of the document in such that, you know, it allows, you know, I've got a view on this, Karen, but allows a degree of common sense to prevail. You know, the only thing that I would add to this very quickly is, of course, it's going to be a piece of law and in its regulation, and then it'll be open to legal interpretation ultimately through examples of enforcement when it comes into practice. But between now and then, the ICO are producing an awful lot more guidance via their website. So this is, you know, on a positive, helpful basis, and around DPOs, I'm sure there will be more specific guidance as there is around data security. The ICO have just released, published a small book actually for, I think, small, medium-sized businesses around cyber security. And I think, you know, Lindsay, as well, in terms of the interaction between the DMA, the Direct Marketing Association, and the ICO. There is a current dialogue going through at the moment around consent.
Yes, and
that's a big subject in itself.
Spoke to the DMA last week, because I'm vice chairman of the DMA Social Media Council, and they said I said, when are we going to get a response? And they said, possibly end of June. But I know the DMA actually have a meeting with the ICO mid-July as well. So hopefully they'll get some clarification on that. Good. Next question. We've got a couple more great questions to ask. In terms of data collection for marketing purposes, how does consent fit in? As Matthew understands it, it's no longer allowable to have opt-out checkboxes, which many people have been using for now. If opt-in boxes are required, what terminology does somebody need to bear in mind to gain consent?
Okay, I mean, I can take that one, Lindsay. But if you, yeah, okay, Article 7. Let's give you a view on exactly what consent is, because consent's a really hot topic for marketing organizations, because it's a little bit chicken and egg. How can we market to a load of people that haven't said that we can market to them yet? Conditions for consent. This question was really around tick box. Was that the type of
Yeah. So ultimately, like if you're on their website and you've filled out the contact form, normally people would have an opt-out for if you want to be contacted. They're going to have an opt-in now, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean that one's a kind of no-brainer. The idea of a kind of silent opt-in is completely gone. You will need to specifically opt in as part of consent, and your privacy statements around what you're doing with that data subject's data. Precisely why you've got it, how long you're going to keep it for, whether you intend to pass it to anyone else. All of that needs to be very clear as part of the consent agreement. So you can't either or A, obviously have a silent tick box, or B, have a tick box without a very clear explanation through a privacy statement why you're asking that person to tick that box.
Yeah, and just to add to that, someone just asked about double opt-ins. So double opt-ins would be a good idea. And just to clarify that what they're actually opting in for. So if they've filled out your contact us form, and that doesn't mean that they actually, even if they opt in, doesn't mean they want to be added to your email marketing list. You have to specifically ask them for that, don't you?
Yeah, and again, in the principle and the, I think the general theme of GDPR is accountability, transparency, and common sense. Yeah, if you actually look through some of the fines and enforcements in the last 12 months, generally they are relating to organizations that have not applied any of those things. So, for example, there are some very large organizations that tried to get ahead of the game and kind of maybe had 50,000 records and said, oh, what we're going to do before GDPR is we're going to mass mail all of them and see if we can get them to tick in, even though a number of them had already explicitly opted out. So, type of silly thing to do, really, in that sense.
Yeah. So we've got two more questions I'd really like to ask, but I am conscious of time. So if we can just give quick answers on these,
sure.
Please. Is there a published list of countries whose data protection regs match GDPR? Karen, would you like to answer that one?
I'm not aware as yet whether there's actually now an approved list. I know that the ICO were going to work on sort of jurisdictions or countries that met it. I don't know, David, are you aware of anything that's
I think there is
contrary to that?
No, I think there is. I'm going to throw the ball to Adrian, who's thumbs up. So
there is a list of countries that the EU has listed that is appropriate. For example, the US is not, although we have the privacy shield at the moment, which people can sign up. You need additional appropriate security measures in place. So there is a list of countries that they already who has the same security measures. So, for example, from memory, there's a country in South America, I forgot the name now, but it surprised me considering that there's a few countries outside Europe that is classed as not safe. So there is a definitive list. That list is growing, and they are going to try and work on improving that. But again, it is up to you. Even in those countries where it's compliant, you still need to ensure that you safeguard the data that you transmit with process and procedures.
Lovely, thank you. And one more question. Are we best to encrypt all personal data, or will other security controls like NTFS permissions and strict company processes be okay?
There's no right or wrong answer. It says the articles say that you've taken appropriate technical mitigation, which means that, for example, let's talk about that very quickly. On NTFS, do you restrict people's permissions? That's great. I've reduced the security. I've protected the data that not everybody can access it. However, if that database is stored on a server where the disks are not encrypted, or the security inside the username, passwords, etc. is not encrypted, you get a virus, it downloads the database outside the organization. Well, the response would be the database should have been encrypted. So you got to do a data processing impact analysis, review all of the risk, and take the appropriate measures to mitigate against those risks. And it's up to each organization, and this is part of the challenge. It is your interpretation. So, for example, my advice to organizations is any laptops, any mobile phones, any device that leaves your organization needs to be encrypted. End of conversation.
Yeah.
Anything that stores personal data, databases, make sure that they are encrypted, and make sure users have access controls in place. But there isn't a right or one definitive. For example, you might encrypt the hard drives, but somebody might still access the system and download the data. So although the hard drive was encrypted, the data was not.
Yeah, excellent.
And actually, it's been good practice. This is nothing new. This has existed right now under the Data Protection Act. It's just because the fines are going from maximum of $500,000 to 20 million that it's sitting in everybody's minds. That could potentially, we need to maybe take it another look at it.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, RJ.
Yeah. I think the important thing to remember is it's not a pass or fail compliance regulation. It's very much a risk-based approach, and you as a business have to sort of carry out the assessment and think, well, what process can I put in? What is fair and reasonable as against the size of my business and what I'm doing with the data?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Karen. And one more very quick question. Mona's just snuck in a little question, which is probably everyone's asking as well. So I'll ask that and then we'll finish. If someone gives us their business card at an exhibition, can we send them an email asking them to opt into our marketing communications?
So I'll take this question because I'm getting it asked a lot. So if somebody gives you their business card, well, you keep it in your pocket. You don't need to do anything because it's not part of a filing system. The moment you take it back to your office and you type it into CRM, you will need to say, 1, notify them that you've put it into CRM, and 2, notify them that you would like to put them onto your mailing list. Do you have the explicit permission? So again, effectively the double opt-in. 1, permission to put it onto your CRM. Secondly, permission to subscribe to your list.
Yeah.
That will be an activity that is triggered out of your CRM system.
Perfect. Lovely. Thank you very much. So thank you all to our great speakers today and for you all attending. We will be sending this webinar recording through to you. So for those of you who joined us a little bit late today, you will actually be able to receive a copy and also refer back to it. Because as I highlighted at the beginning of today's webinar, we just wanted to not apologise for the amount of data that's in today's webinar. But please do keep an eye on your emails and our social media channels, Twitter and LinkedIn, for other great webinars and downloads. But on behalf of Softwerx and Karen, thank you very much for joining today's webinar.